Jacques Cousteau. For generations, his name was synonymous with the ocean. He was the gentle explorer in the red beanie, the man who showed us the silent world beneath the waves. Through his documentaries, he inspired millions to love and protect our planet's blue heart. But like any giant of history, Cousteau's legacy is not without its shadows and controversies, and one of the most persistent and damaging is the accusation that he supported France's nuclear testing program in the South Pacific. You've probably seen the claims online. Cousteau was a sellout. He was complicit. He worked for the French Navy, so of course he supported it. Others will argue he was a quiet opponent, while many just throw up their hands and say, "We don't really know what he thought, so what's the real story?" Did the world's most famous ocean advocate secretly approve of detonating atomic bombs in the very environment he swore to protect? Or is the truth far more complex, a story of evolving science, political pressure, and a man caught between his government and his conscience? Today, we're diving deep into the historical record to uncover the facts behind one of environmentalism's most enduring controversies. To understand this story, we have to go back to the mid-20th century. After World War II, France was on a mission to reclaim its status as a global power. In the new Cold War era, the ultimate symbol of strength and independence was the atomic bomb. So, between 1966 and 1996, France conducted nearly 200 nuclear tests, first in the deserts of Algeria, and then moving to the remote atolls of Mororo and Fangatafa in French Polynesia. These weren't just small experiments. These were powerful detonations that shook the earth, vaporized coral, and sent radioactive fallout into the atmosphere and the ocean. From the French government's perspective, these isolated Pacific islands were the perfect laboratory, far from the eyes of the European public. But they weren't far from the Polynesian communities who lived there, and they weren't far from the minds of a growing number of scientists and activists. Concerns began to mount about radiation exposure, catastrophic damage to the fragile coral ecosystems, and the long-term geological stability of the atolls. It was in this tense, politically charged world that Jacques Cousteau was trying to build a global movement for ocean conservation. And this is where the controversy begins. Before he was the beloved captain of the Calypso, Cousteau was a naval officer. He served in the French Navy and worked in intelligence during the war. For his critics, this early military connection was all the proof they needed. The argument was simple. He was a military man, loyal to the state. He was too close to the government to ever criticize its most important strategic program. But this argument crumbles when you look at his career after he left the military. By the 1960s and 70s, Cousteau was anything but a government puppet. He was a global celebrity, and he used his fame to launch campaigns that often put him in direct conflict with French officials and corporate interests. He fought to protect the Mediterranean from chemical dumping. He campaigned for a ban on commercial whaling, and he spoke out against industrial pollution. Far from being a government insider, Cousteau was becoming a powerful, independent voice for the environment, a voice that politicians were starting to see as a potential threat. So, his naval past doesn't really tell us much. What matters is what he actually said and did when the bombs started going off in the Pacific. The first public comments from Cousteau on nuclear testing emerged in the late 1960s, and this is where the myth of his support comes from. At the time, the science of marine radiology was in its infancy. No one was entirely sure what the long-term effects of fallout would be on ocean ecosystems. Cousteau, always grounding his work in scientific evidence, was cautious. In one interview, he said something along the lines of, "We do not yet know the full consequences. What we do know is that every detonation deserves scrutiny." Now, to a modern ear, that sounds incredibly weak. But it wasn't an endorsement. It was a scientist's warning, a refusal to speculate beyond the available data. He believed that for the environmental movement to be credible, it had to be based on rigorous research, not just emotional outrage. But his caution was his undoing. The lack of a fiery, outright condemnation was twisted by others. Pro-nuclear groups selectively quoted him to create the impression that the great Cousteau saw no real harm. This misinformation planted a seed of doubt that would grow for decades, creating the enduring myth that he approved of the tests. But then, things began to change. The 1970s marked a major turning point, both for the global environmental movement and for Cousteau himself. Public awareness of ecological issues exploded. The science on radiation's impact became clearer and more alarming. And most importantly, protests led by Polynesian communities and international activists like Greenpeace grew louder and more visible. The world could no longer ignore what was happening at Mororo. Cousteau decided he needed to see for himself. In 1973, he dispatched members of the Cousteau Society to the Pacific. Their mission was to assess the risks. The French government, unsurprisingly, restricted their access to the test sites, but his team was persistent. They collected water samples far from the restricted zones. They interviewed local people about the changes they were seeing, and they analyzed all the geological data they could get their hands on. What they found deeply disturbed Cousteau. The evidence, though incomplete, pointed toward significant and lasting damage. Shortly after this expedition, his tone shifted dramatically. He stated, "No one can claim these tests carry no danger. The ocean does not forget. The earth does not forget. This was it." This was one of his first explicit public criticisms of nuclear testing. The cautious scientist was beginning to transform into an outspoken advocate. His journey was far from over, but the myth of his silence was already starting to unravel. By the time the 1980s arrived, Cousteau's evolution was complete. He was no longer just a scientist with concerns. He was a full-blown activist. His documentaries, once focused on the wonders of the deep, now increasingly carried a powerful message about the threats facing the ocean: pollution, overfishing, habitat destruction, and yes, nuclear contamination. The Cousteau Society began submitting official statements to international bodies, including the United Nations. They detailed their concerns about the destruction of the coral reefs at Mororo, the unknown long-term behavior of radioactive particles in the marine food web, and the secrecy of the French government. Crucially, Cousteau began using his platform to amplify the voices of those most affected. He publicly supported Pacific Island leaders in their fight for transparency, compensation, and an end to the testing. By 1987, any trace of his earlier caution was gone. He stated bluntly, "The era of nuclear testing must end. The world cannot treat the ocean as its laboratory." At this point, the idea that Cousteau supported nuclear tests is simply impossible to defend. So if he was so clearly against it by the 80s, why does this controversy still follow him? Why do viral posts and articles continue to insist that he was on the side of the bomb makers? There are a few key reasons. First, the selective quoting of his early, cautious interviews from the 60s. Taken out of context, those words can be twisted to mean anything. Second, political agendas. For years, groups defending France as nuclear program used Cousteau's name and those early quotes to add a veneer of environmental credibility to their position. And third, the nature of the internet. Nuance doesn't go viral. A simple, shocking headline like "Cousteau supported nuclear tests" does. The complex reality that he was a scientist evolving with the evidence gets lost in the noise. He was neither a radical anti-government protester nor a government mouthpiece. He was trying to navigate a treacherous political landscape while staying true to his scientific principles. Any lingering doubt about his position is erased by his final years. In the 1990s, after a brief pause, the French government announced it would resume testing in the Pacific. Cousteau, now in his mid-80s, was one of its fiercest and most prominent critics. He publicly condemned the decision over and over. He argued that the tests undermined global efforts at disarmament, that the people of the Pacific had already suffered enough, and that this kind of nuclear secrecy was an ethical relic of a bygone era. Just months before his death in 1997, he delivered one of his most powerful and definitive statements: "Our duty is to protect the ocean, not poison it." The future asks this of us, so let's answer the question once and for all. Was Jacques Cousteau pro-nuclear? Absolutely not. He never endorsed nuclear weapons or testing. Was he silent? No. He was initially cautious, as any scientist would be with limited data. But his position evolved, and by the 1970s, he was openly critical. By the 80s and 90s, he was one of the world's most famous anti-nuclear testing advocates, using his global platform to call for an end to the program. The claim that he supported the tests is a complete distortion built on out-of-context quotes and political manipulation. The real story of Cousteau and the nuclear controversy is a story about a man willing to change his mind in the face of new evidence. His initial caution was the discipline of a scientist. His later activism was the passion of a lifelong defender of the ocean who, once he was convinced of the danger, refused to look away. In the end, his stance wasn't always perfect or politically convenient, but it was honest, it was evidence-based, and it added to the immense global pressure that finally, mercifully, brought nuclear testing in the Pacific to an end. As he once said, an explorer's duty is to seek truth, and when you find it, tell it, and in his own complex, evolving way. That is exactly what Jacques Cousteau did. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this deep dive interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the history of exploration and environmentalism. See you next time.